This is the first time we're doing anything like this together, and potentially ever. So we're putting ourselves in a pretty vulnerable space right now, because we're talking about things that are deeply personal. And racism is, excuse my French, no, I better not swear. It's crap. Use a lot more words, but it's terrible. I had mentioned before the feeling of a paper cut having healing. That's what I think is the way I can kind of express it. Elias is a member of our youth council. We are so honoured to have you as part of our youth council. I strongly encourage you to have a look at the evidence from Friday the 7th in the afternoon at the Rook. Leanna and I gave evidence with Elias. Elias was the star of the show. More and more, when we do work with our youth council members, I think we should just step back and hand the microphone over to them and just let young people really develop, because the wisdom that came from you that day was absolutely beautiful. And thank you so much for being part of this with me. We're going to start off with some of our own personal experiences of racism. The Commission last year tabled an inquiry into educational experiences of children in out-of-home care called Let Us Learn. We're very proud of this work. It's a pretty phenomenal piece of work. It centres the voices of children and young people living in out-of-home care or have lived in out-of-home care and how they experienced education, schooling systems. And newsflash, it usually wasn't great. When I spoke with Aboriginal children and young people, without prompting, at least half of them spoke straight away about racism. When we asked them about the things that they would like to change at school, racism was a key thing. Not just in its first experiences of it, but in how it was responded or rather not responded to. And it breaks my heart because it took me back immediately to my schooling experiences and the racism that I experienced. And no matter what your age is, you know racism when you experience it. Or you might not know that that's a word for it, but every child knows when they feel excluded, when they are treated a little bit differently, when the teacher maybe drops their smile when they talk to you but smiles at everyone else. Those sorts of things of being treated differently just because of the colour of the skin, something you literally can't change. The racism I experienced through primary school was often very much in the playground, but there were teachers who I could tell who I knew did not think very much of me as an Aboriginal child, as a child of colour. And I was the only Aboriginal kid at school until my cousins came from Fiji, the only kid of colour in the school as well. When I got into high school, the interpersonal stuff continued, but there were other things that that persisted. And I think we talked about it at Uruk. One of the most insidious forms of racism, I think, for our kids is low expectation. Just not having any expectations of what our kids are able to do, of what I am, of what Elias is able to do. I think we're doing all right. I think we've come all right. I wondered if you'd be willing to share some of that.
For sure. I think, as you mentioned, at the time you might not be able to identify and articulate it to be an experience of racism, but I think reflecting on my experiences, knowing what I know now, and through kind of that deep reflection process, I think, like a lot of racism does exist in our schools. I think coming straight out of school, I would have said, I didn't experience that much racism in schools, which, even that in itself is a pretty messed up reflection to have. But the more I kind of learn and the more I kind of reflect on experiences that I had, I was like, that was really racist. And I think, acknowledging that racism isn't exclusive to kind of outwardly aggressive, openly racist remarks, that kind of insidious, some racism, as Meena described it, is like a paper cut and death by 1,000 cuts. And I think what I spoke about at your Rook was kind of the idea of low expectations for Aboriginal children and young people in school, where we kind of enter any environment, whether it's a school or somewhere else, and we have these kind of described expectations on us that we will behave a certain way, act a certain way. And in school that happens to be, you know, poor behaviour, low academic results. And that kind of follows you, and it kind of affects how, like, what you think of yourself and like how you see yourself. So yeah.
It's we've recently started doing some work at the Commission because we wanted to talk more about racism. We wanted to open up the dialogue because so often we're told, "Oh, just put in a complaint." You know, and as I talked about earlier about complaints, the complaint systems often don't work. And so we went to Mildura a bit over a month ago, and we spoke with Aboriginal children and young people about their experience of racism, not just in school, but in so many other areas, going down the shops, being watched, surveilled, over monitored in different spaces. One of the things they spoke about, one person spoke about, was the way you feel in that moment, the body heat that comes up, the prickliness, and wanting to feel small and wanting to remove yourself straight away from that environment. But you can't, can you? It's hard.
No.
Yeah, especially, and education is meant to be a space where you are safe and you learn. It gets in that way.
It absolutely does, and I think personally, like as I mentioned before, racism affects like how you see yourself, and I think I spoke about this at your Rook, and I mentioned your Rook 800 million times today. It impacts how you see yourself, and you go home to a safe environment where you are strong in your identity, but at school you're kind of walking in the two worlds, and I think beyond the personal, it's well documented in research that racism and consequently cultural safety or culturally, feeling culturally unsafe is bad for your health. Like there's evidence to suggest that it is linked to diabetes, stroke, heart attack, all of these negative health outcomes. So it's not only bad for your mind, it's literally like poisonous to your body. So, yeah.
I remember years ago seeing the work of Jane Elias, the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes work. If anyone, there's some nods. It's quite a. We're all showing our age, the people who are nodding. But I remember distinctly. So she does lots of work around African American communities' experiences of racism, and does really direct, challenging work with white Americans. And I remember seeing a clip of hers once talking about exactly this, but for African American communities, high rates of diabetes, of high blood pressure, of mental anguish, of stress, all of these things. And because when you experience racism, it's also activating kind of safety responses. Your body reacts in certain ways, but you're also thinking about, how do I get out of this situation? And if you're in that, it's also similar to any trauma. Learning brain kind of comparisons. You have this feeling like I need to protect myself. So you can't engage in what's going on around you. And I think often the worst thing is when people turn around and say, "Oh, can't you take a joke?" Or, "Oh, that's all right. I don't mean it." Or, "Oh, I'm not like that." It's like, well, actually, your actions just show me you're exactly like that. I want to just see, how's it gone when you've ever called out someone for racism there and then?
I think the issue with calling out racism is that people are more offended by being called racist than the actual racism itself. I think often when anyone kind of calls out racism, there's this process where people who haven't experienced racism in their lives are creating definitions and kind of mediating what racism is and what is and isn't racist. So I think every time I've kind of called out racism, you're questioning yourself because people don't believe it's racism. Oh, is it actually racist? Am I taking this too far? Is this on me? Whereas no, it's actually racist. People just have a shallow idea of what racism is, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you go through the process of, so you have the experience, you have your physical and your emotional response, then you question it and you say, was it, wasn't it? And then you have to make a decision. Do you respond to it in real time, depending on the situation, or do you hold it over? And sometimes if you hold it over, the more you think about it, you often end up talking yourself in and out of whether it was racism.
Yeah.
And then by the time you've gone through that, you're too exhausted to even do anything about it. And I know for me, I've been threatened with, when I've called it out, especially in public, I've been threatened with violence, I've been stood over, I've been screamed at, all of these things, usually from white men who look like they're very upstanding people in the community. And so the very act of calling out racism is in and of itself an unsafe act for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in any environment, whether it's a workplace, school, wherever it may be, we kind of live with the fear of the consequence of reporting racism. And I haven't had an experience where I've reported racism and there's been a good outcome. I don't know many people who have, so I think we kind of live with that fear because of what we've experienced, what our community has experienced as well, that if we are to report it, likely in our kind of belief nothing will happen from it, and with that nothing comes more harm as well. Yeah.
It's often so in our work at the Commission, we want to speak directly to children and young people with the lived experience, because for us, they're the ones with the expertise in their lives. And especially if they're experiencing education systems, child protection systems, or justice systems. And often we get people worried about re-traumatising children and young people talking about these experiences. And that's a good concern to have, because it means you'll think about how you will approach this work, how you'll approach work with anyone with lived experiences and anything. But I often think it's the lack of action that is actually the traumatising part. To talk about something you've experienced, yeah, it's not great, but that's not what's really drawing the trauma. It's the fact that no one did anything about it. No one stood up. No one responded.
Yeah, I think it is such a big concern, especially around children and young people. There's this kind of assumption that just telling their story is going to be traumatizing. Kind of not really understanding that they're living it as well. But I think in telling your story, sharing your truth, as Meena said, the most traumatizing thing is when I guess nothing comes from it, and you're at a point where you've shared your story so many times and it's consistently nothing has come from it, and that is the traumatizing aspect of it.
You touched on the idea and the experience that it's far worse to be called racist than to experience racism, and that's such a disabler to conversations. What else do you think there is that prevents people from talking about racism?
It's a very big question. I think
Just a simple one.
it's a simple question. Yeah, I think, as I said, people are more offended of the idea of being called racist than the idea that people are experiencing racism. I think another kind of big barrier in talking about racism is that people don't people don't want to talk about it, and people think it's not their place or responsibility to talk about it. I think there's this deep assumption that if we leave Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any kind of community of colour, they'll talk about racism and they'll, tell us what's racist and tell us what's not. That's not how it should be, I think. Racism and unlearning racism is an individual process, and we shouldn't rely on the people who are experiencing it to, I guess, police it in a way. So I think that shifting that understanding from, yes, listening to community is important to understand what's racism, but you have to do the work yourself. And I think, yeah, that barrier of people thinking it's not their place to talk about racism when racism is, I guess, working against racism is the responsibility of everyone, not just the people who are experiencing it.
I've been given the wind-up signal, but I just want to ask one more question. Because I want to end on something positive, because we are talking about cultural safety and how do we create it. So what are your safe spaces?
I think my safe spaces are with my community, with my family. I think, although all parents would, for the most part, supporting each other, creating safe spaces where, you know, we can bring our whole selves and celebrate the successes of each other. So I think, yeah, my safe space is definitely with my community.
Just to touch on that, I remember one time someone telling me their Aboriginal kid, it was NAIDOC week, and they said, it was NAIDOC week every day, and that to me is cultural safety. Every day was NAIDOC week. So, can you please all give Elias a massive
thank you. And yeah, just acknowledge all of the points you've raised about the bravery that it takes for Aboriginal people and our young people to stand up and to share their truths in ways that invites you into this conversation that we're all having. So thank you so much. I work with a youth organisation, YLab, and they have a mantra which we've beautifully adopted, which is being tough on systems and gentle on people. And so in the spirit of this, we want to get you to, maybe you might like to check in with yourself, take a bit of a breath. We're talking about stress, we're talking about racism, coming back to ourselves. So I might like to actually invite the room collectively to just take a quick moment and to regulate together in community. And we're going to invite you fellas to, in a discussion, think of some questions that you might like to put to Meena and Elias, remembering the protocols that we signed off on, to be mindful of our language, to be respectful, to know our positionality, to be honest and respectful of these people who are up standing here talking power to truth. So how it's going to work, we've got about 25 minutes before morning tea. People can get caffeinated. Quick little yarn in your table about a question, and we'll invite you fellas to come up and put your question, and then we'll pop maybe one or two to the group. So apologies if yours doesn't get up in advance. We know they're all going to be amazing, but in the interest of time and coffee. So a couple of moments and we'll regroup ways. The first question, I'm just going to direct it to both of you, and you can decide who make choice and agency, which is a really big part of this. Very upfront, we've spoken about this. How do we engage young people in service design? What does it look like? What are the ingredients? What's going on in the workplace when we're doing this well?
Sorry, I have to come up here because the microphones aren't working. I think involving young people in any kind of design, whether it's service design or policy design, it's so important to, I guess, to meet them where they're at. There's such a big appetite for, I guess, the young voice or the youth voice, and even more so for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that, I guess, a lot is kind of asked of us. So making sure that you're not, I guess, burdening them with any more work than, I guess, they're tasked with. I think as well, creating that safe space where you're not overly prescriptive with the agenda. I think, in line with the Indigenous people have a right to self-determination, and a big part of that is, I guess, setting our own agendas. And you might come with an idea to service design or kind of any design where you want input from, but if young people are telling you something different, that's ever right to, I guess, challenge what you're proposing.
We so often just take adult processes and apply them to kids. So we need to think about how children and young people engage and communicate, and think about that might be really challenging to us. We're the ones that want the input of children and young people, so we need to make it as accessible, as safe for them. So, even beginning with how do I, how would you like to do this? How, what time suits you? Don't set meeting times between 9 and 3 o'clock, because, lots of kids are at school then. Think about doing things after hours. Think about providing food. Pizza's always really good. Think about yourself. How would you like to be engaged in something? You'd like to be told about it, get information about it, be given the option of how you engage. Just flip it and think about it from a child or a young person's perspective, because we've learnt so much from the Youth Council, and we've got the amazing Jason up the back who's hiding, but I will call him out. He's our youth engagement extraordinaire person. There's so much learning we're doing, and so, you're going to take steps forwards, you're going to take steps back. Just think about the why you want to do it. You don't want to do it just because it's going to tick off a box. You want to do it because it's going to improve your services, and it's going to make kids feel safe to come to where you are and engage.
Beautifully answered. Wonderful perspectives. I guess there's a theme that's emerged around this notion of, I guess, reporting and monitoring with racism. We know that it's beautiful to have environments that are physically welcoming, but do organisations have ways and complaint handling processes to really acknowledge that racism exists, and how as we as an organisation are going to call it out? So there's a huge theme around that. I guess the question to the group here is this notion of accountability. How do we foster accountability and action when people do in fact feel brave to call out their experiences of racism? And what does that notion of accountability in a workforce mean for you both?
I think if you think about any time you've been called out for doing something wrong, it's not comfortable. It's not nice. You might have done something wrong at work, you might have not been a good friend, you might have, just stuffed up, done something wrong. Might not have been intentional, might have just been a misstep, whatever. When you're called out on it, it feels crap. So if you're being called out, you've got to sit with that discomfort. You've got to actively go, okay, yeah, and reflect. And I think when it comes to racism, because people feel so uncomfortable with it, just like any other sort of discriminatory ism, obia type of behaviours, people feel so uncomfortable with it. They just want to move past it. But it takes strength and it takes self-reflection, and it is mature to sit with that and actually think, could I have done something different? And even if someone wasn't meaning to be intentional with that, it's the way it's received and the hurt that has created. And I think about what kids tell us when they experience racism is that they firstly want to be heard. They just want to be sat with and listened to. And someone who's hurting in that way can come across with a whole rainbow of emotions. They could be angry, they could be mad, they could be crying, they could be frustrated, they could be disengaged, they could completely be shut off because it's like, oh great, it's happened again, of course it would. So you have to be open to those feelings, because these experiences for our kids, for us, they create a rawness. Anything that is attacking your identity in any sort of way opens up a particular type of rawness. So if you're going to be true around accountability, you have to be ready to sit with that and just see what it feels like, and then sorry means you don't do it again. Sorry at least is a commitment to doing better in the future and to understanding where that person is in their pain and then thinking about, okay, what was my role in causing that pain and how am I going to address it in the future?
I think as well, kind of like what I was saying before, is like when people are, I guess, called racist, a lot of the times these processes kind of focus on, I guess, the person who has inflicted that pain, but I guess there's kind of a deep need for supporting the person and kind of centering the process around the person who has actually experienced the racism. So, you know, doing things like not making them tell their story 500 times to be believed, or, you know, updating them on the process. So kind of thinking how to best engage the person who has experienced the racism, as well as, I guess, balancing with addressing the racism itself.
Such a clear example of that was a few years ago in the AFL when an Adelaide Crows player texts someone, maybe someone will know, was racist, said a racist slur against an Aboriginal player during a game, and it was reported. And the way that they dealt with it was to have the non-Aboriginal player and the Aboriginal player, so the user of racism and the experiencer of racism, sit next to each other, be recorded, have the non-Aboriginal player give an apology where he cried and broke down and very much turned himself into the victim in the situation. That's not how to respond. That discomfort of acknowledging your behaviours and your actions is nothing compared to the discomfort of feeling and experiencing racism, homophobia, any sort of ism or obia. And so we need to centre where the pain is and respond appropriately.
Thank you both so much for providing that context. I guess that formally concludes this session, this part of the morning, which is really like lamenting this why, this story. What we would like to do in the spirit of embodying this work is, for the next few moments, we have posed a question to the group and to the people who are listening online. You might like to check in with self, you might like to have a yarn collectively. For those online, you might like to take a moment to just journal or write some points down. But the question is, you know, what has surprised or challenged you from Elias and Meena's generous and loving conversations this morning? What's come up for you? We are going to break for morning tea in the next 5 minutes. We've got about 20 minutes for morning tea, and we'll regroup at 11:45 for a panel discussion around breaking down some more of these barriers of cultural safety. So just give you a few moments to check in with self and the group. Thank you so much.